Back in high school, they taught us that the atom bomb caused Japan to surrender in World War II, but they didn't teach us the real reason. It wasn't the atom bomb that caused Japan to surrender to the US in World War II. Japan surrendered to the US in World War II because they didn't want to have to surrender to the Soviet Union.
I'm a dad, baby.
Yeah, I'm a dad. You're a dad. Hey, and if you're a dad, you know your kids love to hear you talk about history, and especially World War II. And if you're a longtime listener of Big Broccoli Studios, then you also remember soft core history. So we're going to bring it back old school and do a little soft core history today. Back in high school, they taught us that the atom bomb caused Japan to surrender to the US in World War II. But they didn't teach us the real reason Japan surrendered. It wasn't the atom bomb that caused Japan to surrender to the US. Japan surrendered to the US because they didn't want to have to surrender to the Soviet Union. So remember, the Germans surrendered. It's 1945, May, and Germany surrendered. Who did they really surrender to? They really surrendered to the Soviet Union. By that time, I mean, we all talk about Patton, we talk about D-Day, we talk about, which helped. Obviously, it helped because that diverted resources to the West. But the Red Army by this point had absolutely steamrolled the Germans. This wasn't the army that.
Good reason.
Well, this wasn't the army that was taken by surprise by Operation Barbarossa, at the beginning of the war. After Stalingrad, the Soviets regrouped and started their long, brutal process of pushing the Germans back to Berlin. So what did they do to the German cities and the German countryside, and not just the German cities and German countryside, but anything between the Red Army and Berlin? Was just yes, we joke about Sherman and his march across the Georgia, but what Stalin ordered was a scorched earth policy, and this was scorched earth in every sense of the word. So
Sherman would have done it too had he had the technology, I think.
Possibly, they raped, they tortured, and they mass murdered their way. Across Ukraine, across Eastern Europe, across Germany, all the way to Berlin. And they didn't stop once they got through. The rape, the torture, the murder, war crimes continued after they went through. So think you're Japan in 1945, all right? And they had this rare opportunity to predict how the war would go for them once the U.S. Got a little closer. So as an example, after Guadalcanal, after Midway, the U.S. is starting to take islands closer and closer to the Japanese mainland. Finally, to the point where they were within range of these new Super B-29 super bombers, right? And the Japanese didn't have to imagine what it might be like to be bombed into oblivion. They could just look at the European cities. Almost every single German city by that time had been bombed to rubble, and then the rubble was bombed, right? And so the Japanese got to see that. They got to be like, I wonder if they'll do that to us next. Well, yeah, they did that to them next. They conventional bombed and they firebombed almost like over 60 Japanese. That was so prolific with the bombing. They were rebombing things they had bombed, and they were like, okay, what target should we go to next? And they're like, well, we got all the targets. Well, find more targets. Just bomb the rubble. And the firebombing of some of these cities was unbelievable. Like a couple of 100,000 people would die in one night. The bombers were coming back smelling like human flesh. It was so bad, right? And they were just like retching from all this. So the Japanese are like, well, that happened to Europe. And then as soon as they got close enough, it started happening to us, right? So keep that in mind. We're going to come back to that.
It's kind of hard to forget that, but yes.
Yeah, right. All right, so why did the U.S. have to drop the bomb in the first place? Right. Let's talk about what we were taught. It was to end the war sooner. We didn't want to have to island hop our way to the mainland of Japan and then attack Japan itself, the main island, with 2.5 million Japanese soldiers and their built up cities and every civilian with a bamboo spear, right?
Right. Yeah. I don't think people really understand how island hopping worked and why
Mm,
it was set up the way it was. Just turn the globe around. Just kind of crank that globe around and look at the other side, and you'll really get a scope of how thin island hopping was stretched out.
yeah. Yeah, and in fact, in a minute, I'm going to show a map of this area, and keep that in mind. Keep what
Well,
he's
there you
talking
go.
about in mind. This campaign, it was like, we do talk about D-Day for good reason. D-Day was brutal, right? But
Hmm. Hmm.
imagine a D-Day times 10 times 20. That's what island hopping is. You have to do
Yes.
a D-Day every time you take another island, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
So the thought was, and what we were taught was, you drop these atomic bombs, and then Japan surrenders, and you can end the war early that way. As
Hmm.
horrible as atomic weapons are, um, the trade-off is how many more millions have to die through this island hopping business, right?
Yeah.
That's what we were
Yeah.
taught. So then I used to wonder, and people ask, well, why didn't Truman, the president at the time, why didn't he just invite some Japanese diplomats over to the desert, out west, and be like, hey, look what we have. Watch this thing explode. Imagine it exploding on one of your cities. And then,
Yeah.
wouldn't they
Yeah.
just go, oh, well, if you have
We give
that,
up.
we give up,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah. Always wondered about that.
Well, it wasn't the Japanese they were trying to impress.
Mm.
More about that in a minute. So Japan did get a real life demonstration on August 6, 1945. Enola Gay dropped a little boy on Hiroshima, right? The bomb
Hmm.
exploded with the force of one Hiroshima bombs. They're always doing that, right? It's the
You been
force of
saving that
100.
one.
I've been saving that one. I wrote this whole script just so I could say that one joke.
That's right.
uh, This is equivalent, approximate force of one Hiroshima bomb, I should say. Nothing's exact. It's not an exact science, right? But
Yeah.
I'm not a nuclear physicist. Um, but they did that on August 6th. Japanese didn't surrender. So even after they saw what the atomic bomb could do, they still
Yeah.
didn't surrender.
Yeah.
So like if you had invited them to the US and been like, look what we have, they didn't they didn't surrender even after they saw what it could do, right? So
Right.
three
Right.
days later, the US detonated Fat Man over Nagasaki. And on that same day, August 9th, 1945, the Soviet Union invaded northern China. Same day, by
Hmm.
coincidence. It actually
Yeah.
wasn't planned that way. The August 9th had been planned for months for the Soviets to
Hmm.
invade.
As most invasion plans are laid out. Yeah.
Yeah, they had to do a lot of buildup, and they had to kind of set it. They were ready, and then
Hmm.
they waited a minute, and then so it wasn't coordinated with the atomic bombing. It just so happens it was the same day. There's this area of northern China known as Manchuria, and it's kind of in general this area up here. That's this white area. Just to orient everybody, this is the Southern Pacific. Here's Japan up here. Here's Australia down here. New Guinea, Borneo. Some of this may look familiar. French Indochina, aka Vietnam, Cambodia, all that
Yeah.
is up here.
Yeah.
Korea's here. So that kind of gives you an orientation where we are. Japan in the 30s invaded China, and they completely occupied Manchuria. It was known as Manchuria at the time. It's
Yeah.
just northern China now. And just with absolute brutality occupied this area with one of the strongest armies known to man at the time,
Just
right?
the sheer audacity that took.
Yeah.
If you, if you're looking at land mass, that the audacity is just, I mean, it's staggering.
Yeah, when you look at here's little Tokyo, China had always been the big brother, right? And
Hmm.
we could do, I mean, we could do a whole episode just on the lead up to why would Japan do this. But China had always been the big brother and exerted influence over the whole region. Well, China was in one of
Yeah.
its rare, periodic moments of decline. Over the centuries and the millennia, you see that China is like the stock market, right? It goes up, it goes down.
Hmm.
It was in one of its down periods. Japan, after um, after the Western powers had come in and said, hey, Japan had kind of closed in on itself and said, we don't really want to interact with the world. Part of it was they were
Hmm.
afraid of communism. Um, the Western powers said, no, that's not an option. You have to trade with us. So
Yeah.
Japan saw what was happening to countries that the West knocked on the door and said, hey, we're from Imperial Britain. We're here to help. They saw what happened. They get colonized, right? You either get colonized or you colonize in this period. So Japan decided, we'll do some colonizing, right?
It's like the Jesus meme.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. So they invaded China, and the rest is, as they say, history. So anyway, so they're
Mhm.
occupying Manchuria up here. Many months before, many years before, actually, a few years before, 1942, I believe it was, the Allies
Mhm.
had agreed that that the Soviets would concentrate their war effort on defeating Germany in Europe, and the U.S., Great Britain, mostly the U.S., but all Australia, New Zealand, the countries down there would work
Mhm.
on Japan. Right, that was
Yeah.
an agreement they made, and they also said once if we finish Japan first, the U.S. will then redirect forces to Europe. If we finish Europe first, the Soviets will invade Manchuria. So that
Mhm.
was an agreement years before, and then they re-upped the agreement a few months before this and actually started war planning for this invasion. So on August 9th, the Red Army rolls into northern China. And again, just take a look at this. So this is Korea here, right?
Mhm.
And if you look at this gray, this is all Soviet Union, right?
Mhm.
This red down here is the Philippines, which the US now controls. But the US doesn't control this island here, which is Taiwan, and it doesn't control any of this over here, right? So it's close, but it's still a ways away. It's got these little islands here, which is where they're able to fly the bombers from.
Mhm.
But if you're Japan looking at this, you got the Soviets coming in from all these different directions, right? They're
Yeah.
even, they're coming in this way, and they absolutely roll the Japanese, like just roll right over them. They've got
Mhm.
over 1.5 million men, tens of thousands of pieces of artillery, thousands of tanks and airplanes, and this Japanese army that everybody thought was one of the best armies they'd ever seen, one of the best land armies they'd ever seen, just gets demolished. And within a few days, it's really clear that the Soviets, this is all going to be Soviet red. All of this up here, and look at this up here. So if you're
Mhm.
worried about the U.S. having these little islands down here and being able to fly bombing sorties there, what are you worried about if you've got this brutal Soviet army all up here? You're like,
Right.
who's going to get here first? It's it's Berlin all over, right? So just like the leveling of the cities, Japan
Mhm.
had a look at just how accurate their predictions were. Just like in Eastern Europe and in Germany, the Soviets were showing how brutal it was to lose to the Soviets. Because
Yeah.
up here, once again, there's a lot of rape, a lot of torture, a lot of mass murder of civilians, of
Yeah.
Chinese, of the Japanese that got captured, any Japanese women who got, trapped behind enemy lines because, they would take women with them to cook and clean and nurses and all that kind of stuff.
Mhm.
And they were just brutalized, right? So the Japanese are
Mhm.
like, okay, two predictions came true. That's happening to us next, right?
Yeah.
So who would you rather surrender to? So about a week after the invasion of northern China started, Japan surrendered to the United States. One of the most important, this is another side note, one of the most important things to the Japanese, because you might go, well, but the Japanese were fanatical at this point, right? They were fighting to the last person. Um,
Hmm.
but it was super important to them to protect the emperor and to protect their way of
Yeah,
life. Their
yeah,
emperor was basically like a god to them.
yeah. Even as modern as this was, when you think of human history, the fact that they still thought of him almost as such is
Yeah.
crazy.
So, like I said, about a week after the invasion Japan of Manchuria, about a week
Hmm.
after the real life demonstration of the atomic bombs, Japan finally
Hmm.
surrenders to the U.S. Keeping their emperor super important, and they were hoping maybe the Americans would spare their God King. Who knows what talks were going on in the background? Like the Americans were
Hmm.
probably like, if you surrender to us, we'll let you keep your emperor.
Yeah,
But they did. So the U.S. saw whether it was obviously not out of altruism. I'm sure they would they would have liked the emperor to probably suffer the same fate as Hitler, right?
sure.
But they saw the importance of maintaining order. So the occupying forces left a lot of their way. They demilitarized. You don't get to keep your guns and tanks and bombs and stuff, but
Mhm.
you could keep your emperor, keep your way of life. Obviously, you'll get a nice federal central bank, but other than that, and
Mhm.
you'll trade with us. You'll make cheap stuff for us to buy um,
Yeah,
for the next few
for
decades.
decades to come.
Yeah. So that, I mean, if you think about that, it's like, well, obviously, if it had been the atom bomb that shortened the war, why wouldn't they have surrendered after the first one? Why wouldn't they have surrendered after the second one? And why
Yeah,
did it take the Soviet Union invading Manchuria and showing they weren't slowing down for Japan to
yeah,
surrender?
and especially a- as far as bombing a city goes, which is horrible.
Mm,
The second one wasn't nearly as spectacular as the first one. So
mm.
it was almost like, like I don't know, like the sequel to a movie not doing as well as the original.
That never
You mean to
happened.
tell me that's the one that got you hooked? Yeah,
That's a
Conan the
good point.
Destroyer
Yeah.
got you hooked.
Yeah.
You know.
Well, yes. And the at that time we nobody knew yet the long-term effects, the radiation, the cancer, you
Yeah.
know, and nobody knew the long-term effects. So if you're just looking at the proximate effects,
Yeah.
yes, it was only one bomb like other cities had suffered worse. In other words,
Hmm.
Tokyo had suffered worse. These fire bombs had suffered worse. These fire bombings had caused much more death and destruction and damage, right? If you look
Hmm.
at just the one bomb, you go, well, it was horrible. And it happened in 10 minutes as opposed to taking all night. But still, it wasn't like the destruction was the shocking part was it was one plane, one bomb, not the actual destruction part, right? All right, so why the U.S. knew the Soviet invasion is coming. Um, they've seen what the Red Army can do.
Hmm.
They know Japan's not long for this world. And shortening the war using the bombs, did they really think it was going to shorten the war? I don't know. I can't say what they were thinking at the time. But if you're me and you're making this point and you're kind of taking the stand to that, it wasn't the bombs. Then you go, well, why did they drop the bombs then? Um,
Yeah, because hitting a Russian city instead of a Japanese city, like, would have completely went in the opposite direction of what they were trying. What the hope was. So, yeah, like you said, Japan wasn't long for this world. Easy target. You know,
well, we
and a
weren't at
nice little
war. We,
global show.
we weren't at war with the Soviets, right? So that would have been an
Right.
act of war against somebody who
Yes.
we
Exactly.
weren't at the moment
Yeah.
at war with. But maybe it was because that invasion was coming that we used the atom bombs.
Hmm.
By this time, the Allies had already, I think the point you're alluding to, the Allies had already realized that the next major powers conflict, there's always another one. There's always when there's more than one major power, there's always going to be a
Hmm.
war. And they
Yeah.
knew there was going to be the capitalist, imperialist nations versus the communist, authoritarian nations led by the
Yeah.
Soviets. They knew
Right.
a war with the Soviets was next. And it
Yeah.
wasn't going to be long I mean, what would stop the Red Army after making it to Berlin? What was between them and the Atlantic Ocean? Patton's Third Army, like that's going to stop. Like if you look at the numbers of how many tanks the West had versus how many the Soviets had, and the battle-hardened, experienced Red Army, I don't know what would have stopped them from rolling all the way to the Atlantic Ocean,
Right. Yeah.
And what would have stopped them from continuing to roll east in Asia? When you look at that map, they're right there, right?
Hmm.
They could be in Japan, tomorrow. you know,
Yeah.
a lot of people make the argument, well, the Soviets did so well because they used American equipment. Well, by this time in the war, they didn't need the American equipment anymore. They had their own stuff, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, and they would never be in a better position. I mean, they knew it. Everybody knew they would never be in a better position to assert their dominance over the world, right? And to
All
spread
right.
the supremacy of the communism, authoritarianism style of government that they had.
Hmm.
So they did a little demonstration. They did what everybody suggested, right? They said, why don't you just show them what we have and it will deter them, right?
Hmm.
And so they did. They did a little demonstration over Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And Little Boy and Fat Man may not have been responsible for ending World War II, but they may well have prevented World War III. So that is all I have to say about that. Any parting thoughts?
I would like to cover maybe some of the island hopping.
Yeah.
And you had talked about how we could do a whole episode on what led up to the invasion of Japan into China. And if you want to hear about that, let us know in the comments, and we'll definitely take it into consideration.
All right. Thank you for listening and watching. Hope you like this. Like Paul said, comment, send us a note, whatever. We'll do more.
Yeah, subscribe and hit that bell notification so you don't miss a single video.
Our kids love listening to us talk about history, and that's why we're better off dead. Just trying to do the right thing when things are hard, but it shouldn't be this hard.